identifying noise and signal gets very difficult when the noise is, and the volume is cranked all the way up, and that's where we're at now. How difficult is it to spot the signal?
It's actually not that difficult if you consider that we have so much noise. And I think that given there's so much liquidity in the markets, in the macro space in particular, very little is going to actually influence economics. So if you're looking at the macro fundamentals, not a lot of shifting, and even investors are ignoring all of these political signals.
Yeah. Well, Megan, here's my confusion. A lot of people, when President Trump was first elected, said, we're going to give him 6 months to get his feet on the ground, and then we'll assess from there. And we've been there, we're here, and he hasn't gotten anything done, and it doesn't feel like people are really reassessing. Are people kind of like kicking the can down the road for when they'll actually make a move?
So I actually don't think investors have been quite as complacent. I think a lot of the investors I speak to have come to accept that maybe Trump won't push through his entire agenda, and certainly not this year. I just don't think they care anymore. It's not about policy at this point. It's about the opportunities you would have missed if you hadn't jumped into this bull market. And so that becomes a self-fulfilling bull market until all of a sudden it doesn't. It's just that trigger point that's really difficult to forecast.
Well, Michael, my problem is that when you talk to analysts or stock pickers who are talking about the market, they're like, well, you know, earnings was strong. It wasn't about President Trump. It was about earnings. It was really, really good, blah, 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 and that's why we're in the market. So why should anything getting done in Washington be a potential upside? If you're ignoring it on the downside, do you have to ignore it on the upside?
I think it's in part because hope still springs eternal around deregulation, and particularly around tax cuts, right? So the idea is that, I mean, I hear some investors now say, well, since they failed on healthcare, they really have to get tax reform done, right? I think completely ignoring the fact that the very reasons they failed on tax reform are the reason, or excuse me, on healthcare, the reasons they're quite likely to have trouble on a lot of other things, including, as you just talked about in the previous session, the debt session.
Healthcare is bullish.
Well, there's some people who make that argument.
Really get it.
I know. I find that a little less than compelling, but you definitely hear that. Right, exactly. In the current market, everything's bullish, right? And it may be that people are kind of chasing returns. But I think for the stock market, we've had this conversation on before, until you get clear evidence that Republicans are going to lose one or both houses in the midterm election, I think equities are going to continue to largely look past things as basically being short-term blips in the road. They still think in the end something is going to get done. That window is clearly narrowing, however.